Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Education Writers Association's webinar, What's Happening with Colleges Behind Bars. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to our moderator, Jamal, and looking forward to a great conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, everyone, for joining us on this afternoon to discuss what I think will be one of the most important education issues that we'll be covering in the coming year or so. So as education writers, we tend to focus a lot on what takes place in America's schools, K-12 schools and its colleges and universities. And even when we cover policy, whether that be at the State House or the federal, the U.S. Department of Education, we might tend to focus on how policy affects what happens in America's schools and colleges and universities. And it might be easy to kind of overlook another set of facilities where education is also taking place and where historically it has taken place at a much larger level, and that is America's correctional facilities. And so here today, we have a great group of panelists to shine a light on that particular issue. It's kind of an interesting time. It's particularly easy to forget about what might be taking place with education in America's correctional facilities during the time of COVID-19. But with a potential vaccine on the horizon and a new administration coming into place, this might be one of the best times to kind of rethink how we cover education and refocus how much time we devote to the education that is taking place in America's correctional facilities. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into the discussion, which hopefully at the end will include some tips from the panelists on how to better cover education in correctional settings. So our speakers are Emily Norweg. She's a fifth-year doctoral candidate in the Georgetown University Department of History. And Emily focuses on the link between educational inequities and mass incarceration in both the 20th and 21st centuries. We also have Bradley Custer, Senior Policy Analyst for Post-Secondary Education at the Center for American Progress. Has the name been shortened? Is it just American Progress now, or?
We keep the center on there.
Okay, all right. We also have Michelle Jones, fourth-year doctoral student at New York University, who earned a bachelor's degree from Ball State University while incarcerated in Indiana. And we have James McKinney, former Iowa State prison warden, here to join us as well. So with that, we'd like to begin with Emily giving us kind of an overview of funding for higher education. As you know, for many, if not most of America's students, college education is not going to take place without access to some type of financial aid. And so here to give us an overview of the history of funding for higher education in prison is Emily. Emily, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here, and I will be providing a very brief overview of funding for college and prison programs since Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals were taken away in 1994 with the 1994 crime bill. Before I begin, I think it's probably best to set the tone for what the political climate was like in 1994 when the crime bill was passed. So there were many quotes that I could pick from to really shine some light on that climate, but I chose one quote in particular from a man named Representative Bart Gordon of Tennessee, who some of you may know. He sponsored the amendment to ban Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals in the 1994 crime bill. And when he came before the House of Representatives in April of 1994, he opened up his 2-minute speech with this quote: "Just because one blind hog may occasionally find an acorn doesn't mean the other blind hogs will. The same principle applies to giving federal Pell Grants to prisoners." And he went on to explain that just because there are a few examples where incarcerated individuals benefit from college and prison programs, that wasn't enough to justify funding, especially public funding. And in his view, it wasn't a reason to justify what he and others perceived as rewarding bad behavior. And I want to just make the note that even though that tough on crime, really punitive policy was very much part of the lexicon of politics of the 1990s, it came out of a much longer tradition, which really started in the 1960s during the Johnson administration as kind of a backlash to the civil rights movement. That all said, that was the prevailing sentiment at the time, and I do think it's important to push back on that just a little bit, because even in 1994, the numbers were there. They were published in newspapers all across the country, and it was very clear that Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals were not actually negatively affecting anybody else directly. We know that in 1994 specifically, the total amount of money for Pell Grants was actually quite small for incarcerated individuals. They received just less than 1% of the total amount of money that was available. And it's important to note too that anyone who was available for a Pell Grant received it. Incarcerated individuals did not compromise that at all for anybody who was eligible for it. All that did was kind of shrink the pool ever so slightly of the available funding that was there. And in 1994, the New York Times actually reported, they did the math, that if the money that had been given to incarcerated individuals had been taken away and redistributed to everybody else who was eligible for Pell Grants, it would actually only amount to just $5 per student per semester. So that number was really insignificant, and it's important to know that, and know that people did know that in 1994. All that aside, the crime bill was passed, Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals were taken away, and the effect was really, really dramatic. It also had a trickle-down effect on many states who subsequently passed laws thereafter, either completely banning college and prison programs or taking away funding for them, all to varying degrees. We do have some numbers about how negatively affected college and prison programs were, because in 2017, the American Enterprise Institute published a report that said in the early 1990s, there were 772 college and prison programs in the United States. And by 1997, just a few years after the crime bill was passed, that number was only 8. Only 8 college and prison programs were able to survive. And the ones that were able to survive were able to do so simply because of private funding, which came from a few different sources. So of course there were large donors. One of them was George Soros, who in 1997 donated over $1 million to the Maryland state prisons to fund higher education programs there. There were some smaller crowdfunding efforts. One of my favorite examples happened in New York at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. That was in an area of New York that was fairly well-to-do, and one of the people who lived in the area at the time was Glenn Close, who was able to use her power of celebrity to rake in a bunch of donations. And through those thousands of individual donations, they were able to establish a college and prison program there in 1996. There are also a few examples of incarcerated individuals themselves who tried to save their existing college and prison programs. So there's one that I'm still looking into more. I need to figure out how it panned out exactly. But at the Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois in 1995, there was a group of incarcerated individuals who had the idea of creating small businesses within the prison and using those profits to fund their existing program. So they had an idea to set up a photo studio, a pizza delivery service, a laundry service, all in the prison to try to keep their program going. And finally, in the last category of programs that were able to survive were programs that had some sort of relationship with the institution that backed them. So BU, the Boston University program, is one that I've been looking at really intensely, and that program was established in 1972 but didn't receive Pell Grant funding until 1991. So once Pell Grants ended, they were actually able to just sort of revert back to their original funding scheme, where they were able to get support from Boston University. So there was some indication that by the early 2000s, these programs were starting to see a bit of a resurgence. And in fact, in 2002, the Washington Post reported that there were programs once again in 25 states. But it is important to note that that was all mostly because of private funding efforts. And as recently as 2014, there were major backlash efforts against any kind of suggestion that there should be public funding for college and prison programs. I'm sure many of you have heard of the famous example in New York when Governor Andrew Cuomo tried to propose state funding for college and prison programs in that state. And he announced it in, I think, February of that year, and by April had abandoned it completely because the backlash was so severe. And that's why I think that in 2015, when the Obama administration was able to pass the Second Chance Pell Grant program, that was really incredible. It really represented a major victory for college and prison programs. Even though it was on a temporary kind of trial basis, it did represent this kind of new idea that, yes, we can give public funding for college and prison programs once again. And the U.S. Government Accountability Office did a short study for the first few years of the Second Chance Pell Grant program and found that it was able to reach about 8,800 incarcerated students. So that's really promising, especially since a lot of that money, if you look at the list of institutions that receive it, goes to public colleges and universities, the ones that really need that funding most. And I know this has been really quick, but I'll end on a very positive note, which is that in April of this year, 2020, the U.S. Department of Education announced that it would expand the Second Chance Pell Grant program, which is really wonderful. That means that 67 additional colleges and universities will receive Pell Grant funding, and that also means that students behind bars in 42 states will have a chance to participate in college and prison programs.
Excellent. So we'll definitely want to revisit the discussion about Second Chance Pell and what the future holds for that. But before we do, we'd like to hear from Bradley Custer. So a lot of the emphasis that is placed on funding for education in correctional facilities, usually that discussion focuses on the 1994 ban on Pell Grants for individuals who are incarcerated. And what often gets overlooked is the fact that states also have restricted, or some states have also restricted student financial aid for people who are serving time. And so Bradley has looked at that extensively, and we'd like to hear a bit more about what you found and what the future holds for state funding.
Thank you, Jamal. Yes, just to reiterate, I'll be talking about state financial aid programs for incarcerated students. And these are state-funded scholarships for college students, and they are just one of many streams of state funding that may be used to pay for education programs in prison. So to follow Emily's lead on history, I will just add that since the 1960s and 70s, when a lot of states created their need-based grant programs, there has been a mix of eligibility requirements for students with criminal convictions. In some states, those students never had access to these programs to begin with, especially some states around the Great Lakes region. In other states, students might have had initial access to programs, but around the time of the 1994 Pell ban, states, especially in the South, created their own bans on financial aid for incarcerated students. But there are some good examples of states that primarily funded prison college programs with state financial aid. And perhaps the best example is Indiana. What is now called the Frank O'Bannon Grant is Indiana's primary need-based grant program, and it was created in 1965. Possibly going back to its creation, at least to the 1980s, students in prison used that grant to pay for college. Even after the Pell Grant ban happened in 1994, Indiana kept awarding those grants to incarcerated students. And as a result, Indiana had, for many years, one of the best prison college programs in the country until 2011, when the legislature amended the scholarship law and implemented a new ban on that aid program. As a result, just like Emily described, the fallout from the Pell Grant program. The 6 public and private universities that had been offering degrees in Indiana prisons all pulled out. They laid off faculty, and students had no more access to courses, and they had no money to pay for courses, even if they did still have them. So why did state legislators do that? This was right after the Great Recession, and people laid off from work were going back to college. The demand for financial aid was way up, and the state needed more money to pay for it. So state officials did a study to see where financial aid dollars were going, and they discovered that millions of dollars were going to students in prison. They decided that that money should instead go to non-incarcerated students, and they took it away permanently. That's an oversimplified version of what happened there, but it really did come down to money and the state budget. So Indiana was, at least, perhaps the last example of a state that primarily used state financial aid grants as its source for prison college programs.
Yeah, I'm wondering, especially since we're talking to a group of journalists, when it came out what the cost was in Indiana for education for people who are incarcerated, I imagine at some point that hit the news, and it must have been either portrayed either by journalists or politicians in a certain way. Maybe you could just speak briefly about that, but we do want to move to the next speaker shortly.
Sure. Yes, there was some press attention to this. It happened sort of fairly suddenly. The Indiana budget process kind of happens quickly, and so the fallout of the change in policy certainly was covered. There were estimates somewhere between $9 and $13 million were saved by, I should say, maybe redirected from students who were in prison to students who were not in prison. But other than that, I don't think journalists at the time really dug into the deep rationale behind why it was deemed appropriate by legislators to take money away from one group of students and give it to another. And that's why, as part of my dissertation research, I attempted to interview former legislators and other people who were involved to get a little bit more of that story. And this situation is unique because it's fairly recent. Lots of other states have implemented these bans, but sort of as I was describing earlier, they happened in the 90s, in the 80s, even as early as the 70s. And frankly, those people aren't around to really tell us about why they implemented those bans and what were the political or budgetary motivations to do that.
Interesting. So anytime we discuss education in prison, there's the view from the outside, but there's also a view from the inside. And so we want to shift gears a bit as we move to James McKinney, who served as a warden in one of the Iowa State prisons. James, if you could speak a bit about, now you were a warden at the time when the federal ban to Pell Grant went into place, correct?
That is correct.
All right, if you could just kind of speak about, so you're in a unique position to kind of give an insider's view of the before and after in terms of the effect of that ban.
I've worked in corrections for 40 years until I just recently retired. And when I first started in corrections, education was really important in the prison system. We had college classes, we had college classes for vocational programs, and you saw a lot of energy being put forth by the people that were incarcerated to try to improve their lives so that they could get out and make something of themselves. What happened then is we had the Get Tough on Crime, and while that may have sounded good, all that really ended up doing was having inmates sitting around in their cells with nothing to do, and they spent most of their time lifting weights or watching a Jerry Springer show or trying to find something to do that there was just no motivation. It was just sitting down and doing time. And that isn't going to make a person better when they walk out the door. So then when the second grant or Pell Grant came back, you could see the energy start to build again with people wanting to do good things with their lives, become better people, and to try to improve who they were as individuals. And I think what gets lost in all of that is, I know staff even struggle sometimes with, why does a person who does wrong comes to prison and gets college and I have to work and supervise these people? So yeah, there is some controversy there, but we need to figure out if we want these people that we're incarcerating to leave the facilities better, so that they're not coming back to prison, so that they're motivated to stay out, so that they can improve their lives? Or do we want to just continue to think that if we just lock people up, that somehow that's going to make them better? And I think 200 years of prison time, of just sitting in a cell, we've seen over and over, that does not make somebody stay out of prison nor make them a better person. And our goal should be that if we're going to incarcerate people, we need to spend money wisely, but we need to spend it so that we can improve the quality of life for these people, so that when they get out, they can become productive citizens that are tax-paying citizens to help all of us.
Now, it's interesting because, you referenced 2 points in your career. First, in 1994, you see the ban on federal student financial aid for people who are incarcerated. But then you also, toward the end of your career, you see the restoration, at least on a small experimental level, of Pell Grants through the Second Chance Pell program. I'm wondering if you could speak just a little bit to the in between those points. I've heard among researchers that providing education within the correctional facility is actually something that can have a positive effect just in terms of the behavior. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that from kind of a management standpoint. You're responsible for, for running the prison and all the discipline issues that come along with that. How was it tougher without education?
It was a lot tougher because it's hard. You're trying to find something for people to do. And if there's nothing for them to do, they're going to sit around and they start to look for things. And sometimes those things aren't exactly what you want them to be doing. When the education came back, the neat part about that was, and we were fortunate in Iowa that the University of Iowa worked with us. So not only were we having community colleges offering the first 2 years with the Pell Grant, but the University of Iowa actually gave money themselves so that we could start a college program with them. And we had 50 to 60 students enrolled in class, and professors from the university coming over to our prison to actually teach these classes. And each classroom was just filled, and the teachers enjoyed coming over because they said they got more enjoyment of these students in prison because they were so interested in wanting to learn. There was a thirst for learning, as opposed to just some of the college students that they were dealing with. So it was just, and then what happens is that starts to go to other inmates, that they start to tell people, hey, this is a good program, you should come to this. And you just saw the overall behavior of 99% of the inmates involved in these programs vastly improved, because they saw themselves as having redeeming value as opposed to just sitting in a jail cell.
Interesting. So continuing with the insider's view, anytime we discuss education in correctional facilities, there's also the students themselves. And so, Michelle, we'd like to hear from your perspective as one who's earned a bachelor's degree while in Indiana. It's interesting, Bradley mentioned Indiana is kind of a standout program, at least at one time. So if you could, speak to your experience of being able to receive education during that time.
Awesome. And thank you for inviting me. First, I need to do a couple of cleanup things. I really feel like it's important when we're doing this work and we're considering the incarcerated student that we use for person-first language, and not to use language like inmate, offender, prisoner, et cetera, in which to describe people. Secondly, I'd like to say that I was sitting in the facility the day that my program coordinator called me. I was a registrar assistant that announced that the higher education programming was being removed from the facilities across the state. There was some reporting in the newspapers about it, but what was overwhelmingly missing from that reporting was the experience of the women and the men in the prisons themselves. Many of those people were near time cuts that would have brought them home to their families for Thanksgiving and Christmas, et cetera, et cetera. They were going to use those time cuts and the actual achievement of a credential to change their lives, and the literal rug was pulled out from underneath them. It was tragic. It was heartbreaking. It was one of the hardest days that I'd ever spent inside a prison my entire life. We had over 68 students enrolled at the time, and it was devastating. So I really want people to understand that while policymakers are making policy that is to make change and things like that, they often don't think of like the on the ground, the unintended consequences, or the intended consequences that happen to people who are going to be subject to those policies. So I think that's important to state. Also, I'd like to add a comment to the reality that Bedford Correctional was one of those prisons that found ways to use private foundations through philanthropy and famous people, et cetera, to get the Bedford Correctional program started again. But I want to emphasize, because I'm one of the lead researchers on the Women Transcending History Project at Bedford Correctional right now, that it was the women, the leadership of the women, the leadership who made a decision to reach out to the communities, to reach out to philanthropy, to work with their superintendent to make the argument that higher education in prison needed to remain in their facility. So I want to emphasize the student in this. And in my own personal experience as a student and an educator, I think it's critical that we operate, as we look at COVID responses to higher education in prison right now, that we begin to think about orienting ourselves to be student-centered. For example, there are a lot of amazing strategies that higher education and prison programs are doing right now to respond to this period of time in which we have where higher education and prison learning is distant. They're offering, they're sending in videos, they're bringing in jump drives, sending jump drives into staff. They're copying, photocopying, leaving things at the mailbox of the prison. They're coming up with strategies to keep the student engaged so that the student doesn't lose any momentum towards their degrees, right? And I think that post-COVID, for those university programs that are not student-centered, in other words, they've got a great idea for a program, they dropped it into a facility without listening to and talking to students. Those programs, particularly with prisons being one of the major places for outbreaks of pandemics, and this is in another conversation we had recently, you're either in a pandemic or you're going to be in a pandemic. I think we need to be smart about creating student-centered coalitions so the students do not lose momentum as they're transferred from facility to facility, that we create other pathways to funding that are not solely relied upon legislatures and the state. As we have seen in Indiana, that system is fickle, and it is tragic when a higher education and prison program is stripped away from people. I think it's also important that we provide pathways to complete credentials post-incarceration. Not all students can complete while they're in. I have experienced that. I have a lot of friends who experienced that. And often, because the programs are not student-centered, students are literally walking out and unable to complete their degree. And I think that we can do better by them. And I think we should do better by them. That includes creating non-discrimination policies at universities so that students who do go on campus are not discriminated against because they have a criminal history. And lastly, paying particular attention to race, sex, class, and criminality discrimination upon that population and how it is impacting their access to completing credentials. In my own personal experience in my life, it was the advocates who bridged the gap for me, the people who spoke up, who had an orientation towards being student-centered, along with my own desire and tenacity to complete my credentials while incarcerated. And I think the marrying of those two together is what makes strong college and prison programs.
So I find it interesting. You're doing some research, and I think that's kind of a good segue into what will now be, the discussion among all of us. But that is so as journalists, we get stories, but then to help inform those stories, it's often helpful to turn to researchers to see exactly what the effect of a particular program or initiative is. I'm wondering, and this is for anyone who wants to take it, but if you could speak to things like evaluations. For instance, I don't think we have a meaningful evaluation yet of the Second Chance Pell program. But then maybe you could speak to just, research and evaluations on the effectiveness of programs that provide education in prison. What are some of the measures or indicators that we should be looking for?
Of quality programming under Second Chance Pell?
Yeah, for that, or really for any program that is in a prison. Some people like to, and the reason this is important, of course, is because it helps to kind of influence the policy discussion. And depending on what you read, what you look at, this is kind of a bipartisan issue. Some people look at the social justice aspect of it. Others are looking at things like recidivism and employment upon release. So what are the things that researchers and journalists should be looking at when assessing, the quote unquote worthiness of a program?
Right, and I'll go just add this in really quick and I'll open the floor. I think that a quality higher education and prison programming, number one, is student-centered. And it has sat and thought, what is the student's experience in enrolling, in admissions, in doing coursework, access to study hall, access to the library? Have you considered what their living conditions are on the cell? Are the lights in the cell really dim, like they can't complete their reading while they're on their cell, on their bunk? Have you thought about maybe working with the facility in order to create dorm rooms or spaces on the housing units where they can study? Have you thought about orienting the program to the student's experience? And then what is the process of getting access to computers, typing, review and revision? How much time would that student have in terms of faculty office hours? And then what is that process upon completion? Will you do a graduation? Will there be a way to celebrate that benchmark? Will family be invited? And then for those students who don't complete, is there a pathway? Have you thought about, oh, this student gets out and she's a few classes away from completing this credential? What is her pathway to completing that? And that includes that includes that entire reentry process. But I want to caution universities in becoming reentry institutions because they don't know how to do that well. They need to partner with community-based organizations that do that well, so that student is wrapped around with an infrastructure that is going to help them have a stable, safe place to sleep at night while they go to school during the day, or whatever that situation is. The universities need to do what they do well, and then, but also remove their cosmic exclusions of people who are formerly incarcerated. And that means their application process, that means their interviewing process, that means their research and TA and employment at the university process, and on.
Essentially, you bring up the community-based organizations, which is something I completely overlooked myself. So perhaps maybe not during this discussion, but people can follow up for the names of organizations that might be doing particularly well in this regard. I'm wondering if we can shift gears a bit and talk about, we started out talking about the ban on federal student aid that took place back in 1994. But since that time, there have been several efforts to repeal the ban. And I'm wondering if someone can speak to maybe some of the most recent efforts, maybe there's something happening in the current Congress, and then also what might take place under a Biden-Harris administration in terms of just repealing the ban on Pell Grants to people who are in prison.
I can get us started on this one. Next Friday, the 11th, by next Friday, Congress has to take some action to fund the federal government, or we will be in another shutdown. Washington is not in a panic yet, which tells us that they're working on something, and we'll probably get something out of it by then. The reason why this is relevant to this conversation is that the House, in the end of July, passed their version of a education spending bill, and for the first time, I think ever, it included a full restoration of Pell Grants to incarcerated students. There have been many bills introduced over the years that would include that language, but I think this is the first time it's ever been passed in a bill in one chamber of Congress. Now, last month, the Senate Republicans released their versions of the spending bills, and they stripped out that language with a lot of other things that House Democrats wanted. And so in the next 2 weeks, either they will be negotiating those kinds of details, or they will pass some kind of continuing resolution just to avoid the shutdown. But you never know. This is one of those pieces that has moved fairly far along and could just pop up in one of these appropriations bills, and we could have it. If not, the likely vehicle for it will be the next Higher Education Act reauthorization. We were progressing that pretty well last spring, and then the pandemic happened and it completely shut down. And so we don't know if HEA reauthorization will be back on the table this spring. Briefly, a Biden-Harris administration is likely to support restoring Pell Grants. If you go to the official platform website for Biden right now, it says rather confusingly that he wants to restore Pell Grant access to formerly incarcerated students. That's a little bit confusing because he might be referring to people with certain drug convictions, or that might just be a little bit off. But Senator Harris is a co-sponsor on the REAL Act, which is another one of those bills that would reverse the Pell ban. And so between the two of them, we could be reasonably assured that they would support restoring Pell Grants.
James, I'm wondering if you could speak to just what wardens, especially if there's like some type of prison wardens association, are wardens always in a position to speak, their views on the effectiveness of restoring financial aid, or are there just political elements that make that something that they can't really weigh in on?
Wardens typically have to follow the director's decision, and that's politically motivated. So whatever the local state legislators are, whether if it's depending on what the party it is, depending upon what everybody wants to see for college programs within the prison, a lot of the wardens they sit back. And a lot of times wardens have grown up in a system from a long time ago, and they have been drilled about safety and security. And I think sometimes we get so caught up into thinking about security that we forget that the students in the program actually make the prison safer and more secure because they want to do the right things.
Yeah. So one of the things that we wanted to do before we open up to audience Q&A, of course, just bearing in mind that our primary audience is journalists, is just to kind of get some insight, ideas, or tips from each of you, if you have some that you want to share, on how journalists can get like meaningful access to programs. I know with COVID it's going to be more difficult, but COVID hopefully is not something that will be with us forever. But how do we go about getting meaningful access to the programs, the people in the programs, and meaningful data about the programs? Anyone want to take a shot at that?
If I could just,
Yeah.
if I could just jump in really quickly, I'd love to follow up on a point that Michelle made earlier, because I think it's incredibly important, and I think it's crucial to the future of college and prison programs, which is making sure that there's some sort of follow-up and some sort of support for students when they get out of their programs. And that also goes within programs. One of the biggest challenges that I find, whether I'm doing oral history interviews or even as an instructor in the DC jail, is what do you do when students get transferred? Then their credits don't transfer to other facilities, and it's a mess, it's a disaster, and it's something that is really unfortunate for people who work really, really hard to get 3 credits away from a degree, and then all of a sudden they're in a different facility or they're released and suddenly there's nothing left for them to do. So I think that's really important, not only in terms of thinking about policy, but even from a journalist perspective, to try to bring some more light to that, because it's something that really affects people on a personal level.
Yeah, and I would add to that that there is also the potential then for access to higher education and prison programming to be used punitively against students, right? And so students who may be grieving another issue or having a situation here, one of the things one of the threats that I've actually heard is that, well, you don't want to lose your college, do you? Because what happens then is things are allowed to happen in facility because people are afraid of losing their programming. And so it has a punitive side to it as well. When it's used, it can be used punitively.
Yeah, I think that's a tremendously interesting issue to look at. It's also kind of a delicate one, because, like, how do you expose that? But I think anyone who has not been in custody of the state just cannot fathom what it means when your safety and well-being is in the hands of others. It's very difficult to understand what that's like unless you've been in that position. And to speaking out about it could have some repercussions. So it seems like there's a lot of ethical issues that might confront journalists just in writing. Even though it's about education, the fact that it's taking place in a state facility, there's a lot of issues that come to play. I'm wondering, are there any other tips before we're almost at 2:45, which is when the audience Q&A begins? Any final tips for journalists before we open up to Q&A?
When we have had to report on issues, one of the things that we've done is use one of our local community advocates, and we were able to email that person through the JPay system or whatever and tell her what was going on, and she would communicate with the news, the media in that way. And then because there's actual barriers sometimes for us as incarcerated, when we were incarcerated, to talk directly to the media, and sometimes so that meant we had an intermediary or somebody who could share our thoughts. Now that we have JPay and things like that, some emails are going through. Recently we had to fight to get assistant superintendent fired because he was leaving people in unhealthy conditions as a result of COVID, locking them in their cells for 23-hour days without any ventilation or access to toilets and things like that. But one of the things that we had access to was actual emails, and we literally took out their experiences and used it that way. So email is an option, as long as the person the email is kind of like kept anonymous, like who it's from. We've done that as well.
And I think I would be remiss if I didn't point out, I don't know how prevalent this is in actual prisons, but I do know that I did an interview of someone who was at a local jail, and I was surprised to learn that this person was in Wisconsin and I'm in DC, and I was surprised to learn that I didn't have to travel in order to speak with them, because just like you and I are looking at each other on video screens, there is technology where you can do video visits with people who are incarcerated. I don't know how widely available that is or isn't in state or federal correctional facilities, but it is something worth exploring And maybe if it isn't available, maybe it will be, especially really if you think about any time people can make money off of it, and that video conferencing, that they charge for that. So you can best believe
$10 for 15 or 20 minutes or something like that.
Yeah. So if there's financial opportunities, then you can pretty much bank on someone trying to exploit that. But with that, we do have about 13 minutes left. So Allison.
Yes. Thank you so much, everybody. This has been such a thorough and great conversation so far. So I just want to remind our audience, if you have questions, I already see there's a couple in here, use the questions box in your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. And the first one comes from Charlotte West. She's a freelancer. She said, I'd be curious if there have been any efforts to clarify misconceptions about financial aid for people with criminal records, i.e. people who were in local jails that are still eligible for Pell. I'm also curious about any college programs for young people in juvenile facilities or states that are doing this well. So I guess we'll start with the first part, so not to do two questions at once. So clarifying misconceptions about financial aid for people with criminal records, people who were in local jails still eligible for Pell. I don't know who wants to take that first.
I wish I had the name of it, but an organization in California, something about youth to justice, something like that, just released a brand new guide on financial aid for juveniles who had been involved in the criminal justice system. And the whole thing was just basically about myth busting, exactly what the person asking the question is talking about, that there are so many myths about these barriers that people are afraid to apply for financial aid because they think they will be denied. In fact, it was only, 2014 or 15 that the U.S. Department of Education had to issue a guidance letter sort of reminding everybody who an incarcerated person is. And, sort of the definition is that if you are in a state or federal prison, you are incarcerated and therefore you cannot get federal loans or Pell Grants. But if you are in a local jail, a county facility, any kind of juvenile facility, you are still considered incarcerated, I think, and you can't get a loan, but you are eligible for Pell Grants. So I really support any effort that gets at myth busting, and there have been some recent efforts to put that information into, like I said, guides, handbooks, informational flyers that are targeted at youth specifically, so that they know that those resources are available for them when they are, ready to go to college.
Yeah, and we have efforts started in Putnamville, in the Putnamville jail to take advantage of that.
Great. Anyone else have comments on this? No. So then the second part of the question, any college programs for young people in juvenile facilities or states that are doing this well? Thoughts, comments?
Yeah, my thought would be, I guess it's going to depend on how much time a young person has to serve, because if they are still under 18, I'm not sure college would necessarily be part of the mix. I mean, it could be theoretically, because there is a such thing as dual enrollment for high school students, but I'd be surprised if that were taking place in detention or correctional facilities. But I think maybe one of the related questions might be, well, what happens when a young person, is sentenced to an amount of time where they're going to be a young adult by the time they're released, and what are the prospects for college education for such a person?
Lots of story ideas, everybody. Okay, our next question comes from Wayne DeOrio, and his question is, because COVID has knocked out many in-person prison college programs, have any of the schools chosen to expand second chance Pells? Have they been able to begin programs this year? So kind of the COVID effects on if any programs have been able to even get started or continue.
Absolutely, there have. And I have, they're definitely doing hybrid. Some of them are coming in 1 or 2 times a week, but most of them are transferring their in-person courses to mail correspondence. And if the facility has closed circuit television or pre-recorded lectures or conference or videos, they're sending those in with the assistance of staff to run them. Sometimes a designated administrator will hand deliver materials or email them to the facility. And some faculty are also using connectnetwork.com and jpay.com and similar email systems to communicate with students. Those people with secure tablets and Chromebooks and computer labs are able to download assignments and books and notes from teachers and discussion boards in some facilities is actually happening. And so all of that is asynchronous learning. But distance learning is synchronous in terms of a person-to-person in real time via Zoom or video conferencing. That is happening, but that's happening less.
So this kind of feeds into another part of a question that Wayne had, which is, do you know if there's a significant difference between classes taught in person versus online or correspondence courses?
We offered courses that were online for the community colleges, and the students would go up there and sit at the computer desk and do their work. But when somebody would actually come in as a professor, the atmosphere of the room and the energy level of all the students just greatly was appreciated. There was a lot more learning going on, and you could see the students going back to their rooms to be able to visit with one another, to work on their assignments. And the conversation has just totally changed from the typical conversation to one about education and what they can do to be better.
Yeah, in-person instruction is all about creating that culture, that creates a culture or a community of learners and thinkers and people who are designing programs and thinking up their next ideas, right? And so it's totally different. More of this asynchronous learning is done by themselves on their own term and their own paces. And so it's completely different. I'm not going to use the word as bad, because I'd rather have that going on than nothing, right? It's important that we have access to higher education while incarcerated. And if it has to be correspondence, amen, as opposed to nothing.
And the online modalities are pretty new in the prison, college, higher education space. And so as far as answering that question, as far as like what does evaluation research show as the differences in, the pros and cons, I don't think we're there yet, but there are a lot of good organizations that are engaged specifically in evaluating the Second Chance Pell programs, but there are increasingly researchers, educational evaluators who are trying to answer those questions about how do we improve the quality and how do we improve the outcomes of prison higher education programs. And part of that will be which modalities have different effects and which one is best. By the way, while I'm talking, I just looked it up, and it's the Youth Law Center, which is the organization that just put out that report on financial aid for juveniles, the Youth Law Center.
Based in San Francisco or Oakland? Okay.
And
San Francisco, yes.
I have a follow-up, Bradley. You mentioned there are a couple of organizations that are trying to synthesize and collect data on this. Do you know them off the top of your head, just in case reporters want to check in with them for more advice and context?
I would definitely point folks to the Vera Institute for Justice. They are involved in the technical implementation of Second Chance Pell, so they actually help the Second Chance Pell sites implement their programs. And then I think there are a wide range of academics and other organizations that are contracted to do the actual evaluations, and those vary by state and site. The other organization that I would point you to is fairly new in the past few years. The Alliance for Higher Education in Prison is a group of educators, prison program coordinators, academics, researchers that are, we've been meeting as a conference for several years, and now the organization is sort of building, and they're just a hub of knowledge where reporters can be, just asking questions about where they can get information. So those two places are two off the top of my head that I might point reporters to.
I would also,
I would add,
just
go ahead.
the Institute for Higher Education Policy, which is a collaborator with me in this event that you're watching now. I know they recently put out a framework that, gets at some of the things that, are worth looking at when assessing a program. And I know that they also have experts that deal with education in prison that can help illuminate matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also add the Jami Sisterhood. It is a new organization that is designed, that is all educators who teach in facilities, that teach in facilities and have a background in higher education prison. And they focus on pedagogy and purpose and practice for faculty who are going inside through a lens, a racial equity and justice lens. And so I think the Jami Sister is also a resource.
Can you state the name one more time?
Jamii, Jami Sisterhood.
Okay.
And they have a website up with everything that has all the credentials and all of that.
And Emily, did you have a point that you wanted to add?
Sorry. I just wanted to very quickly go back to the question about online versus in-person learning. And I do think that it's something that should be highlighted in this conversation, is that college and prison programs are not just about getting the degree. And in fact, for most of the people that I've spoken to, whether it's people I'm interviewing for my dissertation or the students that I've had in the college and prison setting, it's about being in the classroom. And obviously, if that can't happen because of COVID, it's definitely better to have something rather than nothing. But so much of what is important about these programs is that interpersonal connection and just being able to sit in a classroom and discuss things. And I think that that's why it's really such a shame that we're in this circumstance right now where that can't really happen.
Right. So we are approaching the 3 o'clock mark, but I always like to kind of end on this question, which is also asked by Emily Fortune. So I think this is a good note to end on. She said, you talked a bit about what journalists are missing in the past about legislation regarding Pell Grants. What do you see that is missing or remiss from media discourse now about college and prisons during the pandemic? So this is your chance to kind of correct any narratives that you think are misleading, or stories or points that you think are not off covered or pointed out.
I think that the difficulty with which it is to mount a program, to be correspondence, to meet the needs, and the challenges of some of the barriers that sometimes the Department of Corrections will put up, and the wariness that we need to be, that they won't come back and say, well, correspondence is working fine, we're not going back to in-person. And so I'm very worried that some facilities will say, you've done 9 months correspondence, that's the new business. That's the way we will do business from here on. I'm actually quite anxious about that and worried about it.
Yeah, very fair point. All right, well, I will, since we're at 3 o'clock, thank you so much for that final note of forward-looking stories too that everyone should be paying attention to. I want to thank all of our panelists and for Jamal for helping organize this. Thank you again, everybody. If you are about to sign off the webinar, one last plea to please fill out that survey. And otherwise, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. And thanks again.